bulk of the room back in place, and everybody enjoy that quick break and some coffee and things like that. Feel as good as I do? Fantastic, fantastic. So our next presenter, keeping in the theme of our nature to nurture connections, is a gentleman by the name of Darren Coppin. Darren is the CEO and head of research of Esher House. Now, Esher House, they achieved some world-renowned and world-leading results when it comes to understanding the psyche of young people and how we can take that understanding and put it into a practical application when it comes to how young people are thinking about further employment and careers. So please join me in welcoming Darren Coppin to the stage.
Thanks, Joe. Good morning. Good to see you all. Except for you, Will. I've never liked you. Thought it was an appropriate forum to share that. It's interesting, just walking here along Circular Quay, I was reminded of a fact I learned when I was about 14 years old about youth that stayed with me, scarred me ever since. When I was 14, myself and my two best mates had just come out of a lesson at school where we'd learned that the average age at which a British person loses their virginity is 18. Exactly 18. In Australia, it's 18.3. Now, my two mates were adamant that they'd already lost their virginity. They were 14 and 13. They were the ages they said they lost their virginity. Now, if that average is true, even my schoolboy maths told me that I'd be 27 before I lost my virginity. And I suppose what I'm going to talk about is data evidence, academic evidence, and generalizations based on fact and numbers. But we mustn't really lose sight of the fact that we have an opportunity with modern technology to personalize, so we can put together strategies and policies based on the overall average, but we should still seize the opportunity to personalize. And of course, it was absolute rubbish. I didn't lose my virginity at 27. It's 37. Right, you knew that was coming, didn't you? So did she. No, right, next half hour. The next half hour, the enthralling next half hour, I'm going to take you through an overall view of behavioral science. We're going to get an understanding of young people's neuropsychology, behavioral psychology, and success factors in young people. And then we're going to pull out of that, what are the practical implications for us, for you in your jobs? What can we learn from this and apply? Now, I'm a behavioral scientist. I love behavioral science because it replaces opinion with fact. It takes away conventional wisdom from a lot of decision making. It takes away risk from decision making. And it's absolutely necessary. We've never had a better chance or opportunity of using data and information and fact and academic evidence to inform what we do. So we should feel a lot safer with it all. I'll give you some examples why it's important and of the thinking traps humans fall into. If you were walking along the street and saw this face, within a second, maximum 3 seconds, you would have formed an opinion of this person. Now, almost all of us would have had an opinion. Now, it's not a good example of me showing how we fall into thinking traps, how there are cognitive biases that determine what we think about people, what we've learned in our nurture, and what we've grown up with and born with in our nature leads us to falling into these thinking traps. Because, of course, in this case, you'd be right. But a lot of the time, we fall into these traps due to cognitive biases. These are the 8 ones that we used in a recent piece of work to improve apprenticeship and student completions. But at last count, there's over 120 cognitive biases that we fall into. So I'm going to spend the next 29 minutes taking you through all 100. No. The beautiful thing is that you can boil it down to 4 key behavioral principles. If you bear these in mind, if you're doing everything from perhaps a global climate change policy to trying to get your partner to do more household chores, if you bear these 4 things in mind, everything else falls into place. It diminishes a lot of the chaos theory that falls behind decision-making and predicting how humans are going to behave. Because most of the time, for most of human history, policy has been based on the assumption that humans are going to act logically, which of course we don't. That's why Spock's such an interesting character. there are 4 principles. So bear these in mind. First of all, humans do whatever's easiest. So for most of human history, this isn't because we're lazy. For most of human history, this is because if something's more easy to do, we burn less calories and we're more likely to survive. Secondly, we're incredibly social animals. Everything we do at some level is to avoid embarrassment or impress others. No time more so than when you're 13 to 25 years old. We absolutely crave a sense of control. So even if you really want something, or even if something's really good for you, if you feel that it's forced upon you, you'll push back. But weirdly, we're terrible at self-control. Out of the 24 strengths that have been measured with 3 million adults completing this VIA strength survey, self-control, self-regulation is the least common of the virtues that we possess. I don't know if you've ever seen those Haribo ads where if you give a kid a pile of sweets and say to them, if you leave those for X amount of time, I'll come back and give you twice as many. Well, that is a perfect example, and hardly any of the kids are able to resist them. I'm going to touch upon this because it's based on a famous psychological experiment called the marshmallow test, and it's very relevant for what we're going to talk about today. It's of particular profound interest what we're dealing with today because we've been based, there's this school of the adolescent at Berkeley University, and they said we're at a triple tipping point in human history relating to youth. First of all, there's over 1.2 billion teens on the planet, but that's the greatest proportion of the human race that we've ever had. Secondly, with the technological revolution, that has a chance to amplify what's best about being young, building a sense of connection and community, etc. But also it can amplify the things that are the worst parts of being young, a sense of exclusion, a fear of missing out, exploitation. It can amplify mental health problems. And the third thing that's brought us to this tipping point, if you like, is that adolescence now lasts longer. There is physiologically an earlier onset of puberty for most people, but also there's a postponement of the traditional markers of adulthood. People moving out later, they're starting families later, etc., taking on an enormous amount of responsibility later on. So this gives us, according to Berkeley Uni, an unprecedented opportunity to encourage youth to be a force for good. But we must know what's going on inside the brains of young people, what's informing their decision-making. And actually, this sentence that they wrote, I thought, well, this is a great one. It will make me sound intelligent by putting it up there. But actually, it's quite annoying because it's an opportunity to encourage youth to be good. Well, actually, our data suggests, our research suggests that youth are inherently good. They're inherently authentic, and we need to get out of their way or at least facilitate that. So we'll explore some of these points now. Now this is the thing that drives most youth decision-making. It's the amygdala. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's actually the ancient Greek is an almond-sized, an almond-shaped cluster of neurons in the brain. And this induces emotions and impulses. This is what drives decision-making in young people, for the most part. This is the prefrontal cortex. This controls logic, reasoning, and it controls impulse and moods. So it holds it back. Now, the issue with this is the prefrontal cortex doesn't really develop until you're about 13 and doesn't finish developing until you're in your mid-20s. So you have this amygdala dominating your decision-making when you're young. We'll look at the implications of this, but there was a very interesting experiment that asked young people and adults to look at pictures of people's faces and determine what emotions they were showing. The adults got it 100% right each time. I think we've got their happiness or joy, surprise, sadness, a little bit angry, bad smell, constipation perhaps. All of these emotions, the adults could get it right every time, but only about 50% of young people could interpret the actual mood that was being shown to them. How many of you have had teenage kids and said, look, I've made you your favorite cheese sandwich. There you go. And the kid responds, well, why do you hate me so much? The moods, the misinterpretations are there and they occur all the time. So, young people are often accused of being antisocial. But actually, the reality is the very opposite. They're being hypersocial. Everything they do is to impress their peers, to gain some sort of social status, or not be embarrassed by not doing something. So even the naughtiest young people are actually playing up to this hyper-sociality. It's curious, but it does start to change how we facilitate their decision-making. They take a lot more risks. I don't know if you can just about make that out, but here's a few other pictures. Have you seen these pictures of kids right high on top? They've free climbed to the top of big buildings, taking a selfie. There were more deaths by selfie last year than by shark. And you see a lot of this. There is a disproportionate reward response in young people. That means that rewards have to be big. If you offer a young person something that would motivate a child or an over 25-year-old, that you can measure it in the brain, there's absolutely no response. Rewards have to be big. And of course, for a young person, it's generally social rewards. They have to get 100 likes minimum. They have to get 50 shares or whatever it might be. The amygdala is shouting out, they're screaming to them, do this crazy thing because everyone will think you're great. But the prefrontal cortex is sheepishly silent. It's not developed yet to tell them, no, hold back, calm down a little bit. Have you ever come across this situation? Of course, we all have, because we all form in groups as young people. We all become a mod or a rocker or a modern romantic in the 80s, or into ska in the 90s, into hip hop, or it might be metal. You all join these little groups. And you say, I'm part of this group, nobody gets me, I'm unique. But of course, you look around and these are actually different people that all think they're being completely unique and nobody gets them. This is a trait we have as a human. We want to be unique. We want to make a difference to the world, but we don't want to be a freak. We don't want to really stand out and be embarrassed. So you form these groups. It's exemplified here. If you look at graffiti, 90% of it are people tagging or writing their name or their nickname. This is a young person screaming out at this age saying, I'm making a difference to the world. I'm not just a number. I'm not irrelevant. I'm going to try and change the world, even if it's scrawling my name on the side of a Sydney bus. And you can see that this is happening, that when we get a job, after all the immense pressure that this is the most important decision in your life at 17, 18, you must do this, you must do that, and if you get it wrong, you are buggered for the rest of your life. That's the pressure. That's the installation of anxiety, stress, and depression in young people. But we lose it. We go from the next paycheck. We, as adults, we're looking for how do we make the next payment on our car, on our mortgage, on our superannuation, and then we die. But this is a last screaming. That's quite optimistic, wasn't it? Just feeling like that at the moment. But as young people, they possess this desire to not just be a number, to change the world. And it's laudable. We all felt like that. Probably most of you are in this room or doing your jobs because in some way you justify what you're doing can make a difference. It's not just you being about you. That was my tag as a teenager, mermaid. It was a confusing time. Right. And young people, trying to get them to go to bed. They're always on their smartphones, their tablets, because there's an enormous fear of missing out. But actually, again, physiologically, there's a justification for this. They don't have enough melatonin kicking in to make them feel tired until 1 a.m. on average in your late teens. Whereas an adult, it's from 10 p.m. So naturally, they're going to stay up later. But then you've got the problem of getting up for college or work the next morning, and you just cannot wake them up because they've only had 5 hours kit, 4 hours sleep. This is an issue, but it's just physiological. And this brings me to school. How not to impart behavior and knowledge. One, in talks like this, lasting 30 minutes, most of you will switch off after 20. Actually, the brain has a circuit in the prefrontal cortex that alternates every 90 seconds. You take in what you're hearing, you apply it to yourself, then you think, oh, bugger, I've got to come back into the room and listen to what's being said. But the early start makes no sense. Not only physiologically, because the kids are tired, but also because both parents are often working now. So to try and get them there, drop them off, pick them up, it just doesn't work in the modern world, or it doesn't make sense. It works for 60% of people at school. The majority, and perhaps that's the best we can do in schools. You're always going to have 20% of people that really aren't up to that level at the moment. Their brain isn't developed for learning French, for example, or Mandarin. Maybe at 11 it isn't, but maybe at 13 it would be. But by then they've been streamed into a poor class and they've embedded, labeled on their head that they're just bad at languages. And then for the 20% that are ahead of the bulk, the 60%, they get bored. They start playing up, or they can control themselves. They have self-regulation, but we've already seen that humans are pretty terrible at that. The other bad thing is that increasingly, actually, we're addressing this. School often isn't strengths-based, but schools are getting better. They are starting to address all of these things. Because I used to have a guy come in. Did you ever have it at school where somebody's brought up on stage, a successful ex-student? And I shared this with you, didn't I, Saxon, the other day. It brought up a successful ex-student and said, look, you can be just like this person. And at my all-boys school, it was genuinely an ex-England basketball player. They were saying, you can be just like him, just as successful. So no, we can't. He's 7'3". It's impossible. And that creates deficits. That makes you feel that you're not good enough most of the time. You have to identify what you are good at, what your strengths are, what your virtues are, and then maximize those. How many of us know really, truly what our strengths are? The other thing was, well, I've touched on the 40-minute lessons. You know, they kill you. And then you've got double science, 2 hours long or whatever it might be. It's just terrible. It's not good for imparting knowledge. But the key skill that you need when you leave school is psychological flexibility. And are we imparting that? The trouble with school is that you've got to be compliant. You've got to get in at a certain time, sit down, shut up. If you want to answer the question or go to the toilet, put up your hand. And then the second you leave school, you're suddenly expected to be incredibly entrepreneurial, psychologically flexible, independent. It doesn't make sense. Are we breeding it into our children? Well, some schools are educating this now. It is getting better, but it's a slow crawl, glacial. Exercise, we know that if you get out and about and do some sort of exercise, even if it's just walking, then your test scores will go up. Your concentration when you are sat down goes up. And then finally, homework. You've done all of this, you go home, you need to develop all of these other skills that you need to be good socially, to be good professionally, but no, you've got to sit down and do some homework. Finland have banned the majority of homework now, and their scores have gone up, as you might expect. So, young people don't listen. This is a brilliant piece of research by some unknowns called the Year 13 group. And of course we say that. Young people don't listen anymore. They're always just on social media. That's where they get all of their education and input from. Well, it turns out, actually, no. Parents and carers, almost 50% of people's career advice, the source of that is they're still parents and carers, then the internet. But of course, if I want to know anything, I look it up on Google. Then friends, then school careers advisors who are there for that role, siblings, and then finally social media is where they get career advice in particular. But this turns on its head a lot of perceptions that we have in our roles. And in fact, I'm so scared talking about Facebook, but I'm going to, because this is data from 2011 to 2014, where millions of teens abandoned Facebook. And in fact, the fastest growing groups are the 35 plus, the 55 plus. There's 3 times more 55 pluses using Facebook than teenagers. Really? Well, actually, you ask a teenager and they say, God, you know, I put up a picture, I've got brilliant filters, I've done my eyebrows perfectly, and then my nan says, oh, you look lovely, bit too much makeup. It just gets you off. It's just galling. It's so embarrassing. It gets you onto other social media that your nan doesn't understand, Snapchat or Instagram. God, what Facebook should really do is purchase Instagram so they can still capture this group migrating away. So you can see this happening, and it debunks conventional wisdom. Well, what is interesting is that there's more communication than ever is being written, texts and emails all the time, but there's an issue with this as well that we must learn to control ourselves with. It plays to this negativity bias we have as humans. So as we've evolved for the last 200,000 years of Homo sapiens existing, we've got this pessimism inbred into us. The pessimistic humans were more likely to survive. If you're sitting around a campfire with your friends and you're having a meal at night and you hear a rustle in the bushes, the optimists will go, oh, it's nothing. Whereas the pessimists will stand up and go, hang on a minute, there's something in the bushes. And then a saber-toothed tiger leaps out and devours the optimist because they stayed put. It's a silly example, but you can see over hundreds of thousands of years, the pessimists were more likely to survive. We've got this negativity bias. Now, the reason why this is relevant for more communication than ever being written is that we interpret emails or texts in the most negative way it could have possibly been written. How many times have you written an email, da-da-da-da, dink, send, and then it comes back and they're all blah, 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 really angry with you? And you mean, why are you angry? You know, why are you upset with me? And it's because they interpret it in the most negative way possible, and we must allow for this. We allow for it a little bit. Do you know the difference between emoticons and emojis? I initially thought they were exactly the same thing, but emoticons came out in the 1982, is cited as the earliest example of the emoticon. That's an emoticon. This is the emoji. The first ones were designed in 1999 and rolled out over the last 20 years, of course. This is an emoticon. This is an emoji. We need these things. They're brilliant. It's efficient, but also it tells people that you're not pissed off with them in a sentence, in an email. You've got a little winky face at the end. They're absolutely essential for facilitating human functioning. There's another thing here. At 16, we are programmed to crave popularity, and there are two types of popularity. First of all, there's status. Being the popular kid, doing the amazing things that people aspire to. And you can immediately think about the Instagram examples. The 1% of your life is what you're sharing with everybody. Status is it's even called status a lot of the time on social media platforms. And then the second type is likability. Doing things that prove your worth, that people admire and think, oh, that was nice. Now, it's so much easier to build status than likability. And this is what happens. Hannah Montana turns into Miley Cyrus. What happened, Hannah? But you've got to be aware of this going on with young people in their lives. So, what predicts? So that's a lot of behavioral science, a lot of it psychological, some of it neurological. But what predicts success in a young person? Well, there's one overriding thing, and this is the marshmallow test. And it turned out that the 1/3 of children that could wait 5 minutes, but only about 5% of children could wait 15 minutes to get double the number of marshmallows they were offered. Those children were tracked, and it turned out they got better results in their SATs at school, better jobs, more earnings, lower BMIs. Those children that were able to self-regulate at that young age were able to be a lot more successful. It's an unexpected predictor of success, perhaps. And of course, in the modern world, kids are getting worse at being able to self-regulate, self-control, aren't they? Well, no, it turns out they're not. They're getting much better. In fact, 10% were able to wait 15 minutes before they got double the number of marshmallows at that young age. We're actually twice as good at self-regulating now, or young people are, than they used to be. A bit counterintuitive. It debunks conventional wisdom. To succeed this research, I love this paper, or even care, young people need to know that they matter to an adult, that they matter full stop. But it's not just showing off to their friends. That they matter to an adult is a predictor of them succeeding. This research from the Search Institute, its first finding was, predictor of a young person's success, exactly the same. A personal relationship with an adult that cares, having a safe place to go, a healthy start as a young child, marketable skills. And then finally, this is interesting, having personal virtues or strengths that are valued by your community and lets you be part of something bigger than yourself. It turns out that to be resilient, there are 4 layers of resilience, or that builds resilience. First of all, it's just being self-interested is the first one. The second one is you, your family and friends. You mix a lot with those. That predicts higher levels of resilience in you. The third one is being part of your community. And then the fourth one is being part of something much bigger than yourself, bigger than your community perhaps. Not necessarily spiritual, but a belief in something to hold on to. If you have those 4 layers of resilience, or 4 layers of connection rather, you're a much more resilient person. You're able to bounce back, you're able to keep trying. So many people give up trying to get a job after 5 interview failings, whereas in Australia there's 16 interviews per job on average. There's going to be 15 people let down. So you need to build that resilience for people to keep going back and trying. So talking about jobs, we were asked to undertake some research on people's commitment, readiness to start a job. This was just before the Department of Employment, Department of Jobs, started something called Transition to Work, a youth program. And they said, if we can work out somebody's genuine commitment to finding work, then we can time the interventions to that person's commitment and improve outcomes. If somebody just belligerently doesn't want to get a job, we're actually not just wasting their time, but alienating somebody by teaching them resume writing, interview skills, barista course, whatever it might be. So these sort of charts are horrible to have in a presentation, but it points something out, because we were having a little giggle in Canberra, and we were saying, yeah, we're going to see what young people are like. They all come out of school and they're management material. They're going to do nothing. They're not going to flip burgers. They're not going to sweep floors. They're not going to make coffees. They're management material. They're in the action phase there, straight away. Kids. And then we said, yeah, but there's also another group, bullshitters. They say they're going to do this, they promise they will, but they never follow through. It's called unauthentic action academically. So these are the results that we found. It turns out they're much less. These are comparing over 21-year-old unemployed Australian citizens with under 21-year-olds in red. And the under 21-year-olds were much less likely than over 21s to be in action. No, they're not all cocky. They're not all management material straight away. In fact, they're in this preparation stage more. They really want to get a job, but they're lacking a little bit of confidence in the tools, techniques, and in themselves. And they're actually less bullshitty than adults. They're more authentic. And they're much more likely to be in contemplation. Yeah, I'll get a job eventually. I'll get round to it as a New Year's resolution. There's no pressure, no hurry. You can see how these different attitudes determine what you do with somebody to engage with them and help move them forward. From all of my research over the last 7 years in decision-making in young people and adults, in education and employment, it's just really boiled down to one conclusion, that our species really needs the rashness, the acute social consciousness, and the authenticity of youth to help drive humankind forward as a species. Now, if you think about the out of Africa, that humans moved out of Africa, do you think it was the 40-year-old husband and wife with a nice patch of maize and hunting grounds they always went to that traveled across the world and spread humankind? No, it was the rash, idealistic, optimistic young person that actually pushed out of Africa in the first place. If we look at pretty much all examples of leaps in thinking and technology, it's nearly always been heralded and driven by young people. Here are some of the obvious examples of Gates, Jobs, and Zuckerberg. Were all 19 to 21-year-old when they sort of thought, no, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to go for it. An older person won't. Their prefrontal cortex is saying, think of the risk. Don't be like Saxon. Be like Darren. But we need this. And interestingly, while Socrates wasn't young when he was at his most famous and influential, he was in his 40s, but all the people that sat around him were in their late teens. Plato and Aristotle are in their teens. And you'll see this throughout human history, you'll see it today, that it's always the young people that are pushing forward authenticity, goodness. They were the ones that pushed for non-conscription in Vietnam. Well, you think that might be self-interest. They were the ones at the forefront of all the coloured revolutions in Eastern Europe to bring down the Berlin Wall. Even this week in Bangladesh, students and young people are protesting. They're bringing Dakar to a halt. And what are they protesting about? Road safety. It's not self-interest, it's idealism, and it's the best of being human that they're trying to push forward. So, to conclude this last slide, what does it all mean? Well, to facilitate decision-making in youth, I was very pleased to, I'd not read that government paper, but this overlaps massively. So be clear, don't do subtle, because they can't interpret facial expressions quite as well. But be aware that they're likely to be in preparation or contemplation. They're hesitant. They're not gung-ho pushing forward. They need nurturing and welcoming. Capitalize on that craving for social status somehow. Somehow capitalize on it, but also realize they're acutely worried about being embarrassed. So if you get a group of young people or interns or people together, don't just shove them together and say, right, all stand in a circle, hold hands and say 3 wishes. You know, that's just going to annoy them and alienate them further. Be aware of the embarrassment, but somehow mediate with social and capitalize on social status. Allow for their amygdala controlling the emotions and decision making. But a final point, which was one that you made as well, which is so important to me, we've got to be authentic and not patronize. Don't try and be that cheesy dad at the wedding reception trying to break dance or whatever it might be, metaphorically in what you're doing to engage with people. Be authentic and don't patronize. Get out of their way, but facilitate and keep them safe in their decision making. That's it. Thank you.